My name is Dave Zamoyski, Assistant Dean of Students and Director of Residence Live. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Jim Petosa from the College of Fine Arts. Professor Petosa is the artistic and educational leader of the School of Theater, a position he has held since 2002. In 2012, he was named Artistic Director of the New Repertory Theater in Watertown, Massachusetts. He has directed a number of plays at the School of Theater and productions at the Opera Institute. A member of the Actors Equity Association, Professor Petosa has served on the board of the Society of Stage Directors and Choreographers, the Catalyst Theater, and the Playwrights Forum. Please welcome Professor Jim Petosa.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, and I really want to say it's been great sitting in the back listening to my predecessors speak. Thank you so much for your words. I'm calling this piece tonight simply Telling Stories, the Theater Artist's Role in Society. In coming up with a thought to share with you all tonight, I came upon a quote that I had saved on my iPad from earlier in the summer. I wasn't sure what the purpose would be at the time that I saved it, but I knew it would come in handy. Perhaps the endless campaign of 2016 has me in the mind of looking at presidential words from the past for some inspiration and hope for our future. President Obama, throughout the course of his presidency, has been asked to preside over moments of national grief in light of a pattern of violence that has characterized the American experience throughout this young century. What follows are words spoken in Dallas, Texas, after the killings that took place in that city a few weeks ago, when the president said, "Scripture tells us that in our sufferings there is glory, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope." Sometimes the truths of these words are hard to see. Right now, those words test us because people across the country are suffering. We're here to honor the memory and mourn the loss of fellow Americans, pray for the wounded, and to try and find some meaning amidst our sorrow. Another president 5 decades ago, John F. Kennedy, discussed the role of tragedy in an evolving society. He said, "My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote," this is Aeschylus now, "and even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." Kennedy continues, "What we need in the United States is not division, not hatred, not violence and lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion towards one another, justice to those who still suffer." Much the same can be said of the role of the contemporary theater artist. Practicing the art of theater and drama, like scripture and all artfully inspired stories that chronicle the human experience, is a calling that gives meaning to suffering, purpose to grief, affection to human foibles, and above all, hope for a future in which we are somehow better than the people we were in the past. Some months ago, the Reverend Rebecca Froome, the Unitarian Universalist minister, who serves a congregation in Quincy that my husband and I have belonged to for close to 10 years, asked me to tell the story of our journey through the marriage equality saga in the form of a Sunday sermon. At first, somewhat stupefied by the personal nature of the subject matter, I soon came to think of it as an opportunity to storytell, using the craft of my art form to literally climb up the bully pulpit and do what we teach our students to do every day, Give voice to the truth of your experience and your identity. So let's imagine ourselves here, now in a neoclassical Congregationalist-style building opened in 1828. Below us are crypts containing the bodies of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, their wives, Abigail and Louisa. We are 200 strong. I am standing at the top of an extraordinary and historic bullfinch-designed pulpit. The story gets told. I never thought I'd see the day. How often do we ponder a thought about the quality of the times we live in? We live in interesting times, revolutionary times, challenging times, dangerous times. If you manage to live long enough, the speed of change in modern times almost guarantees you will experience them all. This particular moment in time seems filled with equal measures of hope and fear. But do we dare hope in light of so much genuine cause for fear? Or feeling threatened, do we attempt to isolate ourselves? Do we react or overreact to perceived enemies? Just who are these enemies anyway? Our nation is rife with dysfunction and often seems at the brink of breaking. Sometimes the sheer sum of what's wrong can overshadow our perceptions of progress. I find that in every inventory of what's gone wrong, it can be uplifting to consider what's gone right. We get disappointed when the hope and change we believe in and want doesn't happen fast enough, or that it is met with such hostility that the pursuit of it feels divisive. Today, humbled by the invitation to speak to you, I want to share memories that suggest that sometimes, just sometimes, things can get better. That hope and change are alive in our time. My first partner, Raymond Avila, was a feisty guy, born in Manhattan, raised in Puerto Rico, came to his sexual identity early on, and because of family resistance to that identity, became independent by age 15. I met him when I was 22, he was 23. All of 5 feet 5 inches, Raymond was a pistol. We lived together for 13 years, mostly in a Jersey City apartment we rented for $200 a month, while he trained to become a laboratory technician, and I was working at the first decade of building a life as a theater artist. Poor, but striving, we were happy. Until one morning. Raymond woke up with difficulty breathing. In the weeks that passed, this being 1985, we would learn that he was suffering from the kind of pneumonia that indicated a suppressed immune system. In short, on Valentine's Day, 1985, I was summoned into the intensive care isolation room he was in, where he told me that he had AIDS. He then told me he would move back to his family so that I could get on with my life. I paused for a moment and said, if we were married, you wouldn't do that. We would stay together. If you want to stay, I would like that. The sigh of relief that came out of him is unforgettable. That same Valentine's Day, there was a nurse who came up to me and whispered in my ear a series of words I couldn't understand. What was that? I asked. Again, a bit louder, she whispered in my ear, "You boys need a different doctor. The one you've got doesn't like people like you." Well, at this moment of deepest vulnerability, we didn't know who we could trust. For this unusually long 5.5 years of life that followed, a triumph in itself, this became my Valentine's Day memory until the year after Raymond died. Valentine's Day 1991, the day of my first date with my now husband, Jamie. Me, a 35-year-old, what we called AIDS widow, zombified by grief, was still able to act like a basically happy and reasonably sane person. Meets him, a 26-year-old Oklahoma transplant to Washington, D.C., finding his identity and his family inside the wide circle of a gay subculture that too often self-destructed with increasing intensity, even as it confronted illness and death with the frequency of snowfall in a New England winter. After Raymond's death, I truly never thought I'd live to see the day that I would find another companion in life, but I was wrong. 25 years later, we remain at each other's side. The saga of Valentine's Day changed forever again. The dark memory did not prevail. Life intervened. New light. In many ways, beginning with that day, we saved each other. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was not always easy to determine where you could be open with the facts of your life, where you could not. When Raymond's illness came, maintaining an income, keeping up with whatever medical breakthrough that was coming down the pike, that to provide some hope for survival was the equivalent of several full-time jobs. I buried myself in my work and his care. We had no legal status. Every 3 months, I had to go to social services and regularly attest to his destitute state. Legally, he was a tenant. I was a landlord who was forgiving him his rent. Only through that means could he get the Medicaid that provided medications that were literally keeping him alive. Today, Jamie and I could effortlessly be included in either of our employee-based health insurance options. The idea of being without health insurance is so much more remote that it is hard to remember the dark days of pre-existing conditions, fear of losing benefits if jobs changed, or the real terror of enforced bankruptcy to maintain eligibility for minimal coverages of Medicaid. I never thought we'd live to see the day. September 1st, 1990, we arrived at the emergency room at 4 a.m. The end of the road. Raymond suffering from an incurable brain infection, demented, now comatose in the final hours. The doctor said it would go easier if he was in the hospital for the final part of the process. He went by ambulance. I followed in the car. For the first time in 5 years, when he went into his examining room, I was blocked by the front desk nurse on duty, told I had no legal relationship to the patient, that I would not be admitted to the room. Even my medical power of attorney would not budge this person. At first, I was enraged, but I didn't want this moment to define this day. So I asked him, "When is your shift over?" He said, 6 a.m. I said, "Thank you," and went and sat in the waiting room for the next few hours until the shift changed. The nurse that took over heard my story and was embarrassed and hurt by her predecessor's choices. She couldn't have been nicer, couldn't have been more helpful in getting me into Raymond's room. In moments like that, I realized how much we lived at the whim of the prejudices or enlightenments of people in charge. Raymond would have 3 more hours on the planet. 2009, Jamie was going into Mass General for surgery to remove the small lobe of his right lung as the result of a tumor that had caused it to collapse. He's fine. But at the time, there was concern. Many outcomes were possible, not all of them good. I was ushered into the family waiting room, registered as the next of kin, introduced to the volunteers who provided clear communication between the patient's medical team and you during the entire process, and when it was over, no less than a visit from the surgeon, who gave me all the news, all of it good, and treated me with respect and care as a person who mattered deeply to the patient he had just worked on. When he left, Jamie's mom, we became good friends during that time, and I sat there, and after the many hours of maintaining my characteristic stiff upper lip, I broke down in sobs. They were sobs of joy for Jamie's successful outcome. There were sobs of relief that our relationship was valued by this hospital and all these caregivers, but they were sobs of anger and rage from all those years ago when so few of those basic points of respect and regard and care were afforded us. But never had I experienced how much better things had gotten, and I didn't think I would live to see the day. August 26th, 2011, Jamie and I celebrate our 20th anniversary by getting married. It was a day of celebration and joy, surrounded by communities of friends from church, from work, from the neighborhood, a remarkable day. There was a time when our kind of relationship would elicit censor, negative judgment, ridicule, or worse. The day before we got married, we received phone calls from friends with children asking if they could bring their kids to the wedding because they wanted them to experience it. We've never been so pleased to say, yes, of course. September 13th, 1990, Raymond's memorial service. A month before he died, he asked me in the odd, broken speech left him from his brain infection to thank everyone for him. I told him I could do that. There was a long list of thanks. For all the miserable stories and interactions, there were many more stories of friends and good people who supported us through hard years. The system did not always help us, but there were many, many individuals who did. I believe it was the energy that came from those years that altered the mindset of so many people towards folk like us and our relationships. Few fixed notions of the order of things have met with such stunning and rapid change than the progress in recognizing the basic rights of people without regard for sexual orientation. My wonderful Jamie and I celebrate 25 years together this year. We have a sense that we belong somewhere. While there are challenges, together we forge a life made possible because a society woke up and heard a cry for fairness. The fight is far from over, and the marginalization of so many people for so many different distinctions make the calls for justice deafening. But this story of progress is bracing and gives hope. Truly, things can get better. Let's not be afraid to tell our stories, to let the wisdom of the experiences of life become a source of hope. Let's develop our willingness to share that wisdom and develop the patience and creativity of imaginative listeners who grow in knowledge, strength, and understanding as a result of the hearing of stories. From every perspective of our privileges and our marginalizations, let us share our identities, knowing that the sharing may produce new understandings, for in them is the real promise of hope for the future. Thank you. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah. Yeah, that's fine, please.
Sorry. You've been talking about the marginalization of a lot of populations within our country and within the world right now. And as a theater artist, I wanted to ask you, just over the past couple of years, we've seen like a slow and steady increase of racially blind, or maybe not blind, but purposeful casting of people of color in films, TV shows, and musicals and theatrical productions. How do you feel about the changing of the race of characters in those stories? For example, Hamilton, the musical that everyone's talking about, where the founding fathers that were white are being portrayed by people of color. Or I think actually tonight, the last 5 years is being reproduced with a black man and a black woman. How do you feel about that?
Fine. I feel like the stories are about humanity, and you know, the answer to your question reminds me of the previous speaker's discussion about the labeling of African American and versus black or colored. These are evolving practices. They change with time. Like I remember a time when, say, colorblind casting was considered the most progressive way of looking at race and casting. I remember in 1990 doing a production of Peter Pan in a suburban population in Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C., and it bugged me that African American kids wouldn't get to see themselves fly. So I cast the older brother John with an African American boy who was he was the essence of bookish John. but he just happened to have dark skin. But he was his soul was John's soul. So and that's what I used to say. I said, I'm casting your soul, not your skin color. And that works okay to a point. But now we're in a time where color consciousness casting, because we have to be aware of the choices we make, because it's not all perceived as color blind. But I do feel like if the need is verisimilitude, we accept that people are speaking in verse, and that we don't do that in day-to-day life. We accept that people burst into song in the moment of a scene. If we accept so many theatrical tropes and theatrical gestures that do not reflect the mundane notion of banal life as it's experienced in day-to-day, to put it on a stage, can we not accept variety of color as a part of lifting up the nature of the story we're telling? I have no issue with it whatsoever. Nor do I feel like I need to come up with the next rigid policy that will be deemed useless in the passage of time. So my answer is, be creative. Follow your gut, follow your instinct. There are plenty of critics in the world who will tell you whether your choices were inspired or miserable. That's their job. Your job is to just do what your heart and your gut and your brain tells you to do as a storyteller. Does that help? Okay.
Hello, thank
Hello.
you. Thank you for your talk. Thank you, everyone. I didn't get to say thank you because I didn't get the mic, so thank you, everyone. A lot of you have talked about this idea of hope, and I feel like you all give a huge duty to us. I don't know how everyone else feels in the audience, but it seems like our generation, like we're supposed to, everything seems to be getting better in some respect, of course, not everything. But my question is, usually at these types of talks, I'll just go home and think, don't go to sleep, just think. But what is that hope? How did you manage to, of course you're here, but how did you manage to overcome so many of the obstacles and to stand here and say, keep on having hope that one day things will change? What can you tell me to take away?
I can tell you that the misery of life, unless you figure out how to turn the misery of life into something for which there is a reward, you've got to learn how to reap the harvest that is born of a field of pain, because only then does the horror of some of the journeys of life give you anything, unless you can find a way to make it useful. I think that's just, for me, if I didn't, believe it or not, speaking these words to you tonight costs me a great deal. If it didn't cost me a great deal, they wouldn't be worth it. I hold my breath and go, oh God, I'm going to tell this story to strangers and people, is it too much information? Well, you fret about all this stuff. But my dead partner demands that I tell this story, demands it. And his death feels somehow less pointless if the story gets told. And it must be personal, and it must cost the teller something. It can't be easy. It can't be easy. You got to put yourself on the line. And I'll tell you, the reason it's worth doing is the harvest is a rich one. And you will find, as Obama and Kennedy were testifying, you will find meaning comes in the face of meaninglessness when you dare to do that. And I guess my message is, there's so much work to be done. There's so much work to be done that you can lose heart for all of it. And I guess I want to say, don't lose heart. Do the work, but don't lose heart. And I think all three of us speaking to you tonight are bonded by that. Don't lose heart, but do the work that needs to be done, and the world will be a better place for your effort.